Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Mark Hudson and I work in News UK's diversity team, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today. As part of our briefing, I was told to be more descriptive of my language, so for those with visual impairments, I'm tall, I am bald, I have a beard, which has led to my kids giving me the hilarious nickname Upside Down Head. I grew this beard because I unfortunately look like Gru from Despicable Me, which I appreciate doesn't help those of you with visual impairments, but gets a cheap laugh out of some of the rest of you. So welcome to News UK. This is the home of The Sun, The Times, The Sunday Times, Virgin Radio, Times Radio, TalkSport, Talk TV, HarperCollins, the book publisher. We are on the 17th floor of our office, our home, the news building, and we have a spectacular evening planned. It's a beautiful evening as well. Outside the windows we can see London twinkling in the nightlife. Internally everyone looks equally spectacular as we look forward to an evening of conversation and learning. We're early into our ensuring our workplaces are fully accessible here at News UK, and if you do have any pointers tonight, we'd love to hear about them, about ways we can improve. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about the decor, I'm told. So corporate chic is very pre-pandemic, but unfortunately we're stuck with it. So my colleagues and I, we're here to learn tonight, because whether you believe in the human reasons for ensuring that digital products are accessible, there is very much a business case, an indisputable business case to it. Our products currently reach 40 million people in Britain per month, and there are untapped audiences that we haven't yet reached because, or that we could reach better through improved digital accessibility. There are also loyal audiences our content could reach by reporting on stories that affect disabled people more effectively. We've seen that from some of the letters that we've received from things like Melanie Reid's spinal column in Times, or from The Sun's fantastic recent campaign, the Give It Back campaign, which saw the government hand out £48 million to the families of children to ensure that they've got the support. And the genius behind that campaign, Sam, is going to be on our panel later, and we'll be learning a lot from her. We also have many improvements to make in terms of employing more disabled people into our workforce, equipping them with the tools that they need, and giving them and their teams the equity and support that they need in order to achieve their potential. This isn't just some box-ticking exercise. This is a massive win-win we're finding for News UK, because of the creativity, the resilience, the empathy are just some of the many strengths that our disabled staff are bringing to our newsrooms. It's something to behold, and in order to find more of these incredibly talented individuals, News UK created the Disability Journalism Forum this year. It was the first ever conference dedicated to encouraging into journalism from disabled backgrounds, talking about some of the issues that they face. Incredibly proud achievement for us all, but eye-opening. We've got a lot more to do. We have an absolute responsibility in the media and to ensure that the media industry better represents everyone, and we have an absolute responsibility to ensure that media can be accessed by everyone. But we can't do that alone. So we thank AbilityNet for allowing us to host TechShare Pro tonight, helping us in the media industry to come together with some of the world's leading accessibility experts. We're looking forward to an evening of learning with you all, and in order to kick things off, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mark Walker.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Mark, for your hospitality. It's since we first met, working towards it's been brilliant. It's really good fun finding out how we can work together on this, and obviously having you with the resources you have and the skills and knowledge to share and learn together is obviously part of the picture tonight. So we've got a couple of things planned. First of all, I'm going to have a chat with Jonathan, who writes for Forbes magazine. We've got an amazing panel where we're going to talk about media representation of disability in various forms, and we're going to end with a great interview with Francesca Martinez about her work as a playwright and a comedian and an actor and her experience as a disabled person. So I'm ready to roll. Is Jonathan ready to roll? I'm hoping he's there. Good to bring him in. Jonathan, how are you? I can't hear you.
Hear me now?
I can hear you now. How are you?
Can. I'm good, and I would say good afternoon from New York, but good evening from London. So
Thank you very much. Well, it's really great to see you. Thanks so much for agreeing to do this. And also, you know, when we've had this conversation a little while back, you had COVID, and you're better now, I think, and back on the road to recovery. Brilliant.
correct.
So, for those who don't know you, could you introduce yourself and say a little bit about your work and your background before we get into the Forbes stuff?
Sure. I mean, sort of, it's a loaded question, but sort of people ask me, well, who are you and what do I do? It's an existential question, but I always tell people I'm the professional stranger. I'm trained as a social scientist. My PhD actually is in applied anthropology. And I sort of look at the world of disability sort of through the lens of business, disability, innovation, leadership, and culture. And that's where it all began. And aside from writing for Forbes, I do consulting for corporations, educational institutions, non-for-profits, government agencies, as well as executive coaching. I was advisor to President Obama on disability, diversity and inclusion issues from 2008 to 2011. And that sort of changed the way that I think about disability in that context and drove me to my professional life. But also the other piece that really drove me was the fact that I'm a person living with a disability. I was born with a right hemiparesis, a form of cerebral palsy. So having that lived experience really informs everything.
Cool. And the Forbes work. So you're now, I mean, for us tonight in terms of the media and the representation, your Forbes column is obviously a focus. Can you tell us a bit about how that came out?
They called me, actually. I mean, this is going back several years, and they were interested in pivoting towards focusing on diversity and inclusion voices and areas around. They said, would you be interested in writing a column? And initially, it was about disability in the workplace. That has now, over the last several years, really evolved to look at growing disability economy. And for me, it's become a laboratory. I never really considered myself first and foremost a writer, but I love writing. I always have loved writing. But this was a lab, and it was way to explore ideas. It was a way to present what's going on sort of in the zeitgeist, in the culture around disability and business and that intersection, and thinking about it from a futurist view, as well as looking at the present.
So they came to you. So do they see this as an eyeball attention grabbing thing from their point of view, an editorial side of things? They think there's a readership out there for this type of content. That's interesting. And you were involved in that discussion with them in some way?
Yes, absolutely. And I can tell you that at this point, I have a readership larger than the size of the city of Chicago. So I can tell you by definition, right now, there is an enormous appetite for this and only continuing to grow.
Anything about the demographics and geodemographics of that in any sort of broad sense? Is that primarily US?
Well, it's all over. I mean, at this point, it's interesting when I sort of looked at it the other day. You know, there's a lot of obviously US based because I'm based here. A lot of European, UK, India, which is really interesting, South and Central America. I noticed, but this is a global phenomenon in terms of, and it's a global issue. This is, you know, I always tell my clients and my students, look, disability is unique. It's the essence of diversity. It runs across race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomics, sexual orientation, and so on. And the only minority group anyone can join at any time. And if we're lucky enough to age, we really all become part of this community in some way, shape, or form.
So that, do you know what? I don't know how many people live in Chicago.
Oh, so give or take, depends, you know, I used to live in Chicago, so around 5 million.
Wow. Okay, cool. So on the back of that sort of initial conversation, I'm interested in where it's gone next in the sense of the editorial side as well as your own work. Have you shifted any perceptions on their part about the popularity of this topic? I mean, is it taken off much bigger than you ever thought, but it's blown their socks off? That sort of thing. What it sounds like. It must have astonished with that.
Absolutely, and I can actually tell you today, I had a conversation with one of my editors at Forbes saying, look, we really want to think about doing an event, a Forbes event around the disability economy in terms of what you write about, but thinking about bringing people in from all different sort of corners of this space, because they've never done this before. They've never, but it is on their mind. It is something that at least the Forbes as an institution is thinking about. And, you know, the hope is somewhere around 2023, 2024. I don't know, but at least I know it's on there.
And in terms of the readership, I guess they're seeing that attract a very broad range of readership, not just people with a particular interest in disability, because you've particularly made an effort to reach out to the business community. You're essentially reading, you're writing for them rather than an audience of disabled people. That's the difference in the writing purpose, in the sense you're connecting into the business case. What sort of feedback do you get from the businesses you connect with on those sorts of topics?
I think the feedback is, one, they understand the business case, or at least they seem to understand it. They want to get into this business, quote unquote, in some capacity. But the question is for them, limitation really is always about fear, you know, the F word, as I always call it. And how do we sort of involve ourselves, not only from a DEI side, diversity, equity, and inclusion, products and services. So they understand that the market exists, it's out there, it's now been proven time and time again, but it's also, they're sort of at the other side of this is hiring practices. How do we think about this from a talent management side? So the interest definitely, there is a groundswell and it's bubbling, and there is a want and a desire, but it's really about the mechanics of how.
So, and part of the mechanics, I guess, is how disabled people are represented by those businesses if they're presenting stuff. I know you've worked with brands. Are there examples of brands you think that have got that representation right, or that are doing at least the stuff that's taken them in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now there are, I mean, Tommy Hilfiger certainly is one of those brands, at least from, if you're looking about it from adaptive clothing, and sort of the adaptive clothing market right now is a $400 billion market. So we know that there are a lot of brands who are getting it right. There's certainly one. Adidas, I know they've had a lot of issues on other areas, but they certainly, one of those brands that are certainly getting it right. Walmart, for example, has been involved with this for a very long time, and really you're seeing the fruits of their labor happening in terms of that. Think of other brands, sort of what comes to mind. Obviously, Microsoft, certainly a major player in that. Google as well. I mean, I was in San Francisco about a week and a half ago, and they're doing just amazing stuff. So I think there's a big push, obviously you see on the tech side, because I think of the openness of the companies. But then there are companies in terms of products and services that are really seeing, okay, we have to pivot to make sure that we are meeting the needs of this consumer.
And you've got some great examples there. I think Forbes as a brand is interesting because that, it's a global, brand. In terms of working with them, what sort of barriers do you think they either perceived or still face in the sense of tackling these subjects? We often talk about a bit scared of talking about disability or not knowing where to start, and the panel we've got tonight are going to be talking about codes of portrayal and guidelines and so on. And very often that's because people want to know where to start, they don't want to offend, all those sorts of things. So has that been part of your experience? Are you in the vanguard of that? Are they already doing work around that representation stuff, sort of spreading that word out culturally and adopting it across their broader channels?
No, I get the. In my experience, they have said, do what you want, publish what you want. We want you to be really to galvanize these ideas and push them out there. I've had really, honestly, no barriers whatsoever. The only barriers I've had is for a photo. That's it. But as far as content is concerned, given me carte blanche to do anything and everything and to write and think and talk about anything, which I'm grateful for. And that's in part due to the fact that they've put a tremendous amount of energy and resources, both economically and from human capital side, in the D&I side of their organization, and specifically on the sort of content side.
So other journalists would equally be, within the Forbes stable, so to speak, they would equally be encouraged to work in the same way, given support and guidance might not be the right thing, but mentorship, those sorts of things. Because the journalists are often saying that's where they find it difficult to know where to step into. But you're sort of, that ripple effect of your work and working alongside the peers and others in the network is part of their D&I strategy in that sense.
Yeah, I think so, and we're seeing this again, this groundswell amongst journalists. The New York Times certainly has taken up this in terms of focusing on disability as another major sort of old institution that is reevaluating disability, at least here in the United States and specifically here in New York. That's looking at disability stories and why it's important. So when you have major brands such as Forbes, which has as a very specific audience, it's more of a business oriented, to a more general consumer, which is something like the New York Times, and they're writing about various disability stories, you recognize, okay, this is now becoming more and more part of the everyday culture. And that's important to have that representation.
Yeah, I mean, you sound very positive about that. I don't know whether you feel that that's still a little bit skin deep, or do you really see the change coming around the corner, given, you look back on your relationship advising Obama on policy, and now you're saying, oh, look, all these newspapers starting to write positive stories. What's the dot? Are we on the upward curve? Is it all direction, or are you still fearful that there's other things around the corner that are going to, that it's a fashionable thing maybe?
Well, I can tell you this, Mark. Part of my training is as a psychotherapist, and I continue to do psychotherapy and as an executive coach, and change takes time. But we also see things through an incremental lens. And the more we can see forward momentum, I'm optimistic. So I always look at change, in a very sort of pragmatic way. Sometimes change is sometimes like an iceberg, but as long as there's forward momentum, I'm okay with that.
Cool.
At times.
And next steps, you've got any particular things in the pipeline, either within the Forbes sort of stepping on in some direction, or anything else you're looking at of the similar type?
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking a lot about the idea of human variability and how we connect the idea of human variability to disability. And as far as that, I'm continuing to write about the disability economy and focusing on it as a culture, because it's ever evolving. And I'm always trying to explore all sort of corners, whether it's young entrepreneurs who are doing incredible stuff to new products and services, seeing what's out there. I mean, I still have this interesting question. One of the things that I am interested in writing about, but I'm sort of hesitant, is Elon Musk. Elon Musk, I met him actually about a week ago. And, here is a guy who on Saturday Night Live here in New York stated, okay, I'm on the autism spectrum. I am part of this community. Yet what he's done with Twitter is exceedingly divisive. And those in the disability community are realizing, wait a minute, fired their entire accessibility division, every one of them. So what does this mean? And is this a step back, and how his impact can really affect change, particularly on a social media platform that's so ubiquitous? So it's an interesting question. And I have a few questions for him. And I think I want to read about that.
That sounds fantastic. Well, I know it's a special day in your household, so I'm so pleased you joined us, and thank you for your time. Jonathan, it was brilliant catching up with you. I'm sorry you weren't here, so we could sit in the bar later and chatter all evening as well. But you've offered some fantastic insights there, and it's amazing to see the work that you're producing and all of the thought that's going into that sort of sense of direction and the progression that's being made. And it's fantastic having you in the vanguard there pushing on. So thank you so much for joining us. You've given us so many ideas to pick up now as we move into the panel. So thank you, and take care.
Great evening, everyone. And thank you, Mark.
Thank you. So that's cool, wasn't it? He's, I don't know, presumably he will be interviewing Elon Musk next, because that is his way. So next part, I'd like our panel to join us up on the stage. They're all sitting here, I think. I've got a spotlight in my eyes. So we've got an amazing panel picking up on the points that Jonathan made about culture shift in the media. A lot of what we're going to be talking about is that your phone, Joe?
Oh, no, it's fine, sorry.
We're going to be talking about, in fact, I'm mic'd up now, aren't I? That's all right, I can sit down. We're going to be talking about media and representation of disability from several different perspectives. We might need to shift a bit. Have you got enough room?
Come around.
Lovely. So I can see it.
Yeah.
Cool.
What's that?
We're good.
We're going to be talking about media and representation from a number of different perspectives. Really all quite different, but I think the thread that I found as I went round was some of it's to do with sort of setting ground rules and understanding how important they can be in representation, but way beyond that in terms of people's experience of working within different media and different settings that relate to the media to try and see what the common ground is, and also look at some of the next steps and ways forward that we can be working towards. So what I'm going to do is for each of the panelists, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and just respond briefly about one particular element of the representation jigsaw, and particularly relates to the media. So let's start with Clive. Clive produces content for AbilityNet in our Dispatches magazine, but is also part of Policy Connect, and is particularly interested in legislation and policy. So Clive, can you introduce yourself, any more of the biography that I've missed out, and say something about where you think legislation could be leading us in terms of representation?
And Clive has wanted I will open that good pushing it. And so why I'm not used about synodical dispatches.
Hi everyone, I'm Robert. I work with Clive at Policy Connect, and I'll be acting as his PA this evening. Just repeating what Clive's saying. So Clive was saying, I'm Clive. I'm a senior policy manager at Policy Connect, cross-party think tank, and I write the Dispatches newsletter for AbilityNet.
I mean, it's a really good time to be having this discussion about the treaty representation and technology.
I think this is a good time to be having this discussion about disability and technology. From a
perspective, the moment where government and the citizens get involved in the digital and social media.
From a policy perspective, we're in a moment where government is increasingly getting involved in conversations about digital media.
Just one example is the online festival we see it all, but we see over the past year, and despite being withdrawn, I think it can become more important.
For example, the online safety bill that has received a lot of publicity, and despite being withdrawn, it's very important.
I feel like, although it's an important discussion we have about how disabled people supported and encourages to be part of conversation and in particular how you can make sure that the rights are preserved in doing so.
I think there's an important discussion to be had about how disabled people in particular can be part of policy conversations and can, let's say, on rights? Sorry.
Being part of conversation on social media.
Sorry, be part of the conversation on social media.
And make sure their views are represented.
And make sure their views are represented.
Online and on all media.
Online and on all other media.
And the discussion that we need to have about the whole government policy, in protecting people's rights. For example, there's been a lot of research about online hate crime.
There's an important discussion that we need to have about government's role in, social media? In social media regulation. For example, there's been a conversation about disability hate crime.
Online hate crime, which has been on the increase. Recently, and which is present in our policy discussion, but hasn't been so far including the debate.
Crime has been on the increase recently, and it's been present in. Did you say it's been present in some policy discussion?
No,
it hasn't, it's been on the increase recently, but it hasn't been present in policy discussion to date.
there's an opportunity for government to work with social media companies and reading more generally to help create a more inclusive public forum.
So I think there's an opportunity for government to work with disabled people to create a more inclusive public forum.
Sense of what that forum might be?
As I was saying before, besides Twitter and WhatsApp and Facebook are already really important for lots of people in getting the views heard and represented. But it's about making sure that the phones are firstly accessible and secondly that we also aware of the challenges involved.
You're saying that social media platforms are being used by disabled people to make their voices heard, to make them accessible. Yeah. As I was saying before, social media platforms such as Facebook are already being used by disabled people to make their voices heard, but we need to make sure that those platforms are accessible.
Cool. Great. Well, what I really liked about this when we talked about it before, I think you set like the biggest framework. It's the government's job to create the policy. We need those frameworks to be in place. I think the challenge, as we'll go through the group, I think the challenge is how those rules are implemented. But I think what you've set out there, talking about the lack of consideration of disability in some of the online safety policy, and finding a place for disabled voices to be heard in that discussion, I think that chimes with some of the other things we're going to that making sure that it's disabled people who are leading those conversations and that it's their issues that are being discussed and raised. So that's a fantastic place for us to kick off, so thank you, Clive. Sam, your rolling guidelines and policy is very different, and also Mark obviously mentioned some of the work you were doing around the campaigns. Could you tell us a bit more about what your role is, and then in particular how that leads into the guidelines work that you're working on?
Yeah, so I worked in this building actually. I was assistant editor at The Sun. I have a daughter who has complex needs, which meant it was hard to keep going in that job that I had. So I set up a PR company that works with charities. I always said I wasn't going to work with disability because it was stone, and here I am. So I work with the Disabled Children's Partnership and trying to get support for families and children and impact policy. And as I was approached by News to write a style guide for the titles here and for use within the company, and that was to cover all different intersections. So it was disability, also gender, sexuality, age, and it was a fascinating piece of work. And really, really, and it obviously had to come from the people that we were talking about. So it was a huge amount of interviews, discussion, debate, lots of debate, and it's a piece of work that will change, that will continually change, and it's very much this is where we are now, but keep adding to the conversation. If there's things you don't like, tell us. And there's a hard copy of it, but there's also been adopted by the individual titles because they have their own style guides anyway. The Time style guide is very different from the Sun style guide, for example, although they're probably getting a little bit more similar. and they've kind of been absorbed into those existing guides. So it's been disseminated in different ways.
And a style guide, a journalist is used to using a style guide, I guess, is part of that mix, isn't it? So in a sense, you're embedding some of the work that you're doing, embedding into a tool that they're using every day for lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
Did you? I'm just thinking about Clive's comment about disability in the sense of how it was considered in the online safety stuff. Did you find that disability was already in the mix, that you had more work on that than you might in other areas? Just thinking across the breadth of diversity, were people comfortable talking about disability in the way that they might have been about gender, or was there?
I think gender was the toughest one.
Was it?
Yeah, because that's become so very political. There are a lot of politics around disability as well. But I think the audience that it was for, you've got to remember that there will be disabled people in the building, obviously. There are a lot of disabled sun readers, interestingly. It's quite highly in the audience. And I think that the journalists were sort of greeted this piece of work they really welcomed it, because their tool is language, their tool is writing, and they wanted to get it. They want to be accurate all the time, and so I was kind of slightly concerned that there might be a bit of a pushback, sort of anti-woke, but we didn't find that at all. And so I think it has been. And
how recently did you start working on published versions? I mean, how recently would people have seen the work?
It was published earlier this year.
So you're beginning to see a ripple through into.
Yeah, we are, and I think people sort of debate terms a lot. As we all know, there's so much difference of opinion on how no one agrees on any one term, really, rarely. So it was this is the best way we feel at the moment. Yeah. But there's a lot of discussion around how it can be updated, for example. It took quite a long time to research. We wanted to, speak to as many people as possible. So, but we think you never can be 100% accurate. No. But I think we did quite a good job. And personally, as a mum, I now think so differently about how I talk about my daughter as well. So she doesn't have capacity to. She has learning disabilities, so she doesn't have that capacity. So I have to think about how I talk about her and what I choose to say to her as well, really carefully, because it's me talking on her behalf. So personally, it's been fascinating and important, I think, as well.
Interesting. And so just a final question, I think, is you haven't talked about the process of embedding it into the work of the journalist. Do you do workshops? How do they come across this? It's one of those things that you might imagine where people, in another sense, might be introduced to it and have it explained, or is it just there the next day and carry on using whatever they had before?
It was announced that it was coming. It was then sort of absorbed into the style guides, and then there's a lot of within this company. There's a lot of kind of they have Friday huddles where staff can sort of to people who've been involved in parts of the company that they don't really know about. So we had a session on there where we talked about the creation of the guide. Mark mentioned the Disability Journalism Forum, so we invited people. I was on the steering committee of that, like very much sort of stood back and just sort of watched people get on with it. But as a non-disabled journalist, it was interesting to sort of bring people up from downstairs and say, look, this is going on, and the guide is there for you to understand and kind of read and take into your work.
Cool. Well, thanks for that, Sam. And I think part of the theme is going to be how it gets implemented, isn't it? And beyond the code, beyond the guidelines. So we've got a short video. Unfortunately, Nicole couldn't be from Channel 4, so I spoke to her briefly. They've introduced a code of portrayal of disability, which is a interesting parallel, I think, to what you've got. So if we can play the video. Here she is. Hey, Nicole. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm really interested in what Channel 4 is doing in this area. Can you tell me a bit about your role and about the code of portrayal that you launched this summer?
Yeah, definitely. So I am the Creative Diversity and Disability Project Manager at Channel 4. So my role includes looking after all of our off-screen initiatives to help get more disabled talent into the industry at all levels. I also work with commissioning to make sure that we are delivering on our diversity guidelines and our code of portrayal, which we launched in July. There's been great representation that we've seen recently across all broadcasters with changing conversation and challenging cliches around disability. Ourselves at Channel 4 have had award-winning Paralympics coverage since 2012, and they're the cornerstone of our disability representation, and we are so proud of them, but they aren't the full story. We're committed to what we call a Paras and Beyond editorial approach, aiming for consistent and committed portrayal across all genres. So this has been demonstrated in some of our recent programming, like Crazy Drone's Trip Hazard, Living Wild with Sophie Morgan, and a hard-hitting documentary about disability and abortion, as well in sort of our long-running shows as well, like Hollyoaks, First Dates, Gogglebox, and The Great British Bake Off, and of course, The Last Leg. We want to make sure that we're showcasing different types of disability portrayal and that it's being done authentically, originally, and with nuance. And what we're moving away from is sort of oversimplifying of the disabled experience on screen, falling into sort of one-dimensional tropes and stereotypes. So we developed the code of portrayal to firm up and articulate how we deliver in both quality and quantity of an on-screen representation of disabled. We wanted to outline our clear commitments and give detailed steers as to how we go about delivering the original nuance and authentic portrayal of disabled people, which our viewers, disabled and non-disabled, want and expect and deserve.
But so what's the next stage in terms of its implementation? How are you going to then roll it out, and who are you going to be connecting with?
Oh, great question. The code not only allows us to get into more engaging and creative conversations around disability, but it also gives us a framework of accountability for our production partners and for our commissioning editors. So it's ensuring that we work with the best talent on and off screen to allow us to deliver on it and make sure that we get to that higher standard of portrayal. So myself and our disability Ali Castle are in constant communication with the commissioning floor and with our production partners, collaborating on those commitments within the code. Those commitments are broken down into program and portfolio level. So at portfolio level, the commitments require commissioners to have a range of portrayal types in their content, including incidental. So that's where the character happens to be disabled without it driving the story. And then there's integrated, where disability is present and may be directly addressed if relevant. And then core, where disability is front and center of the program. And then at program level, the commitments include ensuring disabled people in Channel 4 programs have their own voice and tell their own stories wherever possible. So there will be sense checking against able gaze, where assumptions and projections about the disabled experience are made by non-disabled people. And being disabled will be presented as a valid identity rather than something to be ashamed or shocked by. In line with our commissioning diversity guidelines, there is an explicit commitment to seeking disabled actors for disabled roles in scripted content. Also to ensure a volume of representation, which will allow for a full spectrum of disabled experiences to be shown. Every series from now on will be expected to have at least one disabled performer, contributor, guest, or presenter with the intention for more than one. By having these commitments, we then, as I said before, are holding ourselves accountable to creating content which is authentic to the fluidity and diversity of the disabled experience and representation of disabled people.
Well, brilliant. I love the way you've taken those simple principles and sort of embedded them into that code and explained things in the way of what you're trying to achieve. But also, I love the way you're then implementing that and bringing it into the processes and showing them the sort of different levels of activity that you need to undertake. It really explained that beautifully. So looking ahead to 2023, with that code behind you and beginning to implement it, is there a particular priority for you in the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, definitely. So we have some fantastic off-screen disabled talent in the industry at the moment and at a senior level as well. But what we need to make sure that we're doing more of is getting more senior disabled talent. So we need to be looking at how we can be progressing our mid-level talent and how we can be getting them into those like AP jobs and exec jobs so they can have that senior editorial input on all of our programming that we're putting out there. So yeah, that's my next thing. That's my thing for next year, is to make sure that we're getting more senior disabled talent out there in the industry and making sure that they're having their voices heard in those rooms and we're getting that authentic portrayal out there.
Fantastic. Well, good luck with that, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm really sorry you couldn't be here to join in the conversation with our amazing panel, but thank you so much for all your help, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Cool. So you won't see any reference to the actual detail of the code of portrayal, but I do recommend you look it up, because I didn't want to do something today that actually led you through it. It's a fairly simple document. It's incredibly straightforward in the sense of what it's trying to do. And as you can see, it's the best for a process. It's not just run through and do this, do this, do this. It's saying, here's some principles, and now go and apply them in a number of different places. And I think that's a really powerful way for Channel 4 as a broadcaster to change the way that it portrays disabled people across all of its and it produces a lot of content, and it shares a lot of content. Shani, you know more about that than I do, because you were at the launch, and we were talking about it earlier. So could you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your take on the portrayal of disability from, and also more generally about the way that you see the questions we're asking here about the representation of disabled people in the media.
Yeah, sure, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Shani. My visual descriptor is I'm a South Asian woman who has a short stature, and I'm wearing a teal dress which is really on brand with the AbilityNet colours, which was a coincidence. It's great to be here today. So yeah, I was part of the launch for Channel 4's Disability Code of Portrayal, and when you will read it, or if you've already read it, it's so simple. It's so simple, and you kind of think, well, why aren't people doing it already? So it's a simple set of prompts, actions, and guidelines, really, to help people make much more inclusive decisions, not just make decisions based on your own knowledge, your own bias, and ensuring that when we are representing disabled people, it's most nuanced and, much more intersectional representation than we're currently seeing. And I think just to build upon that point of representation, many years ago, I was minding my own business, enjoying my career as an event manager, and it wasn't until I sort of looked up and looked around at the disability representation that I didn't really see that it was representative at all. It wasn't diverse, and I thought, okay, I want to be part of the change that I want to create in society. I'm South Asian, we're the second largest population in the UK, but disability is still a very big taboo topic in the community and many other ethnic minority communities. So when we actually aren't represented, or when we don't have accurate portrayal of our lives and of our stories, we really miss the nuance and the interesting perspectives of storytelling, and we miss opportunities to challenge outdated perceptions. We miss really interesting stories. I'm 35 years old now, and I've still only ever seen 4 disabled people of colour on my screen, and I just don't think that's okay. I'm someone who also really lives at the intersection. I'm South Asian, I'm a woman. I experience disability, but quite often when we see disability representation or disabled people in the news or media, it's disabled people talking about disability. We need much more incidental representation. We have to stop pigeonholing disabled people to only talk about disability, because there's so much more that we are, that we want to do, can be, and want to talk about as well. So I think it's really, really important that, yes, we have more disability representation, but we're ensuring that actually we're really representing, the 25% of the population that are disabled in this country.
Do you think that the code is nuanced enough to take that into account? You know more about it than I do, and the commissioners and so on. Are you seeing that shift? I mean, from the launch, it won't be instant, but it looked to me like it embedded lots of that great principles there. So are you positive about that next step from that point of view, whether it's Channel 4 or elsewhere, obviously?
Yeah, it did. It really talks about, nuanced approaches and intersectional perspectives. So it's all there, but really, as with lots of other things, it comes down to the person implementing it right. And I love the fact that Nicole there, said production should have a minimum of one disabled person. Absolutely. And you know what's really annoyed me with the cost of living coverage is it's not really included many disabled people, but we are the experts of living in a cost of living crisis because of all of the unavoidable costs that we face. And when disabled people have been represented or have been asked their opinion, we're being asked, how do you feel about the government giving you £150? Oh, yeah, it needs to be better than that.
And you mentioned some of the shows you've been on, which I'd like you to tell us a bit more about. But do you feel that they are breaking out of that pigeonhole? I mean, in the sense of how you've got some control over that, obviously, because you're sitting in the room and saying stuff. But are they, is that conversation changing? Like Loose Women, you mentioned, those sorts of programs, which are totally mainstream.
Yeah. Yes and no. Some shows are doing it better than others.
Could you tell us a bit about the shows that you are?
Yes, sure. So I'm a consumer expert on Rip Off Britain, which I love. I love helping people save money. So I'm a guest panellist on Loose Women, and I present some other segments on BBC Morning Live, and a contributor on Jeremy Vine on 5. Naturally, I think I fall into this tendency. I'm like, right, we've got to talk about this story. This isn't okay. This isn't okay. This is ableism, because I'm very aware that non-disabled people won't be talking about it. So it is hard when you're one of very few disabled people in that space, because ultimately you want to represent, the people that you represent, or your communities, but there are shows where they're like, no, Shani, we don't want you to do that, we want you to talk about this, and that's absolutely fine too. So it's a balancing act, I would say. And look, there's been so much going on right now in society. It has been important to talk about certain things.
Yeah, it's natural, I guess, that you feel like you've got a voice and you need to use it.
Yeah.
That's
But I think the real change will be when non-disabled people are talking about it.
Yeah. Cool, thank you. Well, and thank you so much for joining us as well. So you, I think, we were discussing, I think you're sitting inside News UK now, and we're going to talk about the guidelines, but also you came from outside. I'm interested in what you're doing now, but also just this idea about whether codes and guidelines have been valuable to you in the sense of what you're doing. So tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm Jo. I'm a white female, 25, wearing a very pink jumper that probably matches the colour of my cheeks right now. And I also have dyslexia, dyspraxia and ADHD, so I'm neurodiverse. And I'm an ambassador for the British Dyslexia Association, so super passionate about that. But I'm also a journalist, and I think a lot of people think, oh, you can't be a journalist if you're dyslexic. But you can be a good storyteller without needing a good writer. So remember that. So before I started working at Times Radio, I was on this program called the YouTube Creator Program for Independent Journalists, where it was part of the Google News Initiative, and I set up a YouTube channel for a year, making content for them, which was amazing because it gave me the opportunity to be really creative with my storytelling. I started learning how to make animations, all that sort of stuff, and I absolutely loved it. But I found there's a lot of limitations as like a one-person team. You can't respond to breaking news really fast. And if you actually want to, make news accessible, which was always my goal, to make news more accessible for like people like me who struggle with like reading and all that sort of stuff, then you need to like go to like these big organizations who have that audience and like bring your skills to them. So that's why I joined Times Radio, and for them I've been making like video content with them. And so guidelines are really important, but I also think as well it's like formats and styles and how we tailor the content that we're putting out there as well. So, so much amazing content goes out on the radio, but then, if you have like auditory problems, or auditory processing issues, you're not going to be able to really like fully, take in all that information. But if you like transform it into a video or a TikTok, which is more like fast paced and visually appealing, then people are going to be able to experience that to the same level as people who are listening to the radio. So guidelines are really important, but also like experimenting with styles and formats I think is really important, especially when at the moment like majority of young people are getting their news from social media. So I mean, it's sort of a win-win if we try out with these different formats.
So I'm wondering whether you feel, Shani was saying about being pigeonholed, are you the young, hey, Joe, can you do the TikTok?
But I love the TikTok.
You love it. So you don't mind that?
No, I love it. It's where everyone's at. Like, all my friends, you know, they're on TikTok or they're on Instagram, you know, that's where they're hearing about these things. So why not go to them? You know,
and are the
why
guidelines
wait for them
helpful
to
in that
come
sense?
us?
I mean, the stuff
Yeah.
that Sam's sort of producing in that sort of, I'm imagining a style guidelines for journalism from 25, 30 years ago are a document that you're going to then type something, essentially. But you're in a completely different realm when you're shifting from one medium to another and looking for guidelines to help you navigate that. So are they helping you in that way? Are they positive, sort of strengthening the messaging in a positive way?
Definitely. And I think as well, you know, just having like open conversations with people as well. It's like a learning experience, isn't it? No one's perfect, is what I think. But if we're actively learning and like taking on these things and learning from them, then that's always going to be a good thing.
And is part of it for you the work you're doing, because it is in multimedia, you are working in several, you know, you're able from one format to another, that presumably that's part of the pleasure of working in that way, is you can become more tuned into different people with different ways of communicating, so you're trying to choose the right medium and the right format for the right message.
Yeah, like you could have one story but then tell it in a million different ways. So, you know, and if you do it like that, then you're going to appeal to so many more people than if you just follow that one route. So.
And did you step into a team, or are you in a team where you feel that's news to them, or are you just, I mean, in a news team there will be lots of different skills. Some people will be more leaning towards radio or TV or other formats. So are you sort of a part of the jigsaw for the news team itself in the way you're working? So,
because I'm primarily based in like the social media team, so all our video content goes across all our social media channels, but then majority of our social media team, they take the content that's on radio and they visualize it and then they put it out onto YouTube. And, you know, videos get millions and millions of views. People want that content, you know, but they want it on social media. Yeah.
So do you feel like you've moved from where you had, I don't know, I'm assuming on the program you're describing, you had pretty much complete control on what you put inside the video and what it said. Is there a constraint on you now in your new role? Job, you've got somebody can tell you what to do with it. How does that constrain it? And do you feel the representation is different? And as in, you were simply, in a sense, representing yourself and choosing how to do that. Now you're representing other people's stories in other ways. Has that made that more difficult, or are you aware of the change in how you're communicating around that?
I don't know if constrained is the right word, but I don't know. No, sorry.
You feel like someone who likes the challenge, so it's not likely to be.
Exactly.
But I'm thinking about how you represent, particularly in terms of disability. Are you conscious that you're sort of representing in the stories you're telling in a particular way, and being clear that that's done in a particular way in relation to disability? Or is it just invisible? It's built into what you're doing.
I guess with the stuff I did on YouTube, a lot of that was I had like a lot of like talking about neurodiversity and that sort of stuff. I probably haven't done that much at Times Radio. Me working at Times Radio and being able to create these different formats, I feel like that's me giving that accessibility to other neurodiverse people as well. So I think, making those various formats my way of giving back to other people who have similar like struggles to me. Yeah.
The opposite of what you're saying, Shani, about I'm not here to talk about neurodiversity. That's not. I'm not your neurodiversity correspondent.
Yeah.
Simply creating content because that's my job.
Exactly.
Yeah. Although having said that, you were saying about Matt Hancock. We were talking about everyone's talking about Matt, and we wondered how many times he'd mentioned dyslexia, and we were saying he hasn't mentioned dyslexia at all, and that was for going on I'm a Celeb. And Joe said that actually on Times Radio we've been talking about it a lot. So
definitely, yeah, Matt Hancock.
Are you excusing him then?
No,
I was just interested that there was that conversation.
Exactly. Like he says he's going to go on there to talk about it, but as a result, I've seen lots of news coverage about it. But let's wait and see if he actually does talk about it on I'm a Celeb.
Cool. And by the way, ignore that. We can go on. You haven't got 47 seconds.
I'll do it really quick.
Dom, we're talking about your role in relation to these sorts of things around guidelines and stuff, and I thought that brand playbook stuff is interesting. Can you tell us a bit about the work that Purple Goat does anyway, and in stuff around the influences, but also this idea of when you're working with brands and how they portray and represent disability?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, I'm Dom. I'm of short stature. I'm a powered wheelchair user. I've got jeans on, no shoes, a shirt that had a stain on it until my colleague got it out. So thank you, JC. A jacket and a flat cap. So I work at Purple Goat. I'm the head of strategy at Purple Goat, and essentially we're an agency that's disability-led and disability-focused, and we look to essentially champion authentic representation with all brands that we work with, whether that be in kind of high-end film production or insights work, or kind of a social campaign activating what you call creators or influencers. Ultimately, we're looking to kind of leaning on what these guys have said earlier. It's to kind of represent disability in a way that's real, and by kind of leaning on the lived experience of the actual community themselves, and not just slapping an image of the wheelchair and saying we've done this really well. Ultimately, by leaning on those with the lived experience themselves, you get that nuance of conversation, of story. You don't have to just have this sort of blue flash and light above your head saying, I'm disabled, and you can actually start talking about other things. You know, I think the point around, you know, we want to see, you know, incidental representation of disability, people that have other passions and interests, and actually frame a more kind of holistic picture of a disabled individual, not as just someone that's going to, you know, wave their finger and say, oh my God, you haven't got accessible entrance into your hotel. You know, like, it's far, far more nuanced than that in terms of the life and the lived experience of someone disabled. I think in terms of the brands we work with, more and more as time goes on, we find that we're really hand-holding them through the experience of working with, we're in and around disability. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of people that just want to bury their head in the sand and go, we don't know where to start, so we're just not going to start at all. And we encounter that all the time. And ultimately, we're there to, you know, let them take the baby steps and show them the baby steps that's authentic and real, and not just, you know, we don't want them to, of course, be self-serving, but we want them to actually make fundamental, incremental change. And so we kind of take them on that journey, and as an agency that, you know, we have 50% plus lived experience of disability within our team, we're able to kind of confidently help them on that process. I think just picking up on your point around playbooks, that is something that we have worked with brands to help create. I think that they're a really valuable thing to do because there is that kind of leveling up of understanding. What I would say though is, as I'm sure everyone on the panel would agree, is, you know, that's one piece of the puzzle. And, you know, this educational layer that it can bring is amazing, but it's also that, okay, well, what are we going to do in a year's time to see whether it's worked? And how are we going to make sure that everyone new that comes into the business actually understands it and isn't just fed it? So it's that kind of holistic educational layer around disability that comes from all aspects of life, that we just need to have that kind of hive mind, help everyone to just be more comfortable and confident. We do a lot of training, and I think that, you know, in that training, we just, more than anything, want people to be comfortable. We say that we're creating a safe space and they can ask anything. Very rarely has that backfired, where they ask crazy questions, but, you know, it can happen. But we want to give that safe space because we want them just to be kind of, you know, release the shackles of everything they've learned around disability and everything they shouldn't do or shouldn't say. Obviously, that means in the moment, we're the ones that have to sometimes take the crazy comments, but it is a really valuable exercise because they leave the training and, like, we hear about them going straight to HR and kind of saying, well, I've got as well, but until this moment I didn't think you cared, but you clearly care because we're having this training session. It's all of those kind of things where you see this kind of general confidence grow, and ultimately for these style guys and things to really take heed and be implemented, you want to make sure that everyone is comfortable and confident in and around that whole subject matter. So there's that training bit to be done, you know, at the same time, I think.
And are you, I mean, in your experience, particularly in that relation to how people are communicating and how confident you feel, they feel. Are you positive? We heard Jonathan saying it's going in the right direction. It might be quite slow. How does that sound to you in terms of how you're working with clients in all sorts of different settings?
I think I can sum it up quite well by looking at the sponsor list on this TechShare Pro poster behind me. And I think 3-4 years ago, that wouldn't have looked the way it did with those global brands on it. And I think that genuinely, I sat there and that gave me genuine confidence that, you know, in the last few years, we obviously, oh God, I'm going to be the first one that says the P word, aren't I? Pandemic. And we did see that kind of lens shift and people start to feel like they could engage in a conversation with disability because it was just in the social consciousness that little bit more. So conversation, you know, obviously we had the Me Too, then we had Black Lives Matter, and then there was this kind of swell around the pandemic that did start to unlock more conversations that maybe haven't been happening up until now. So I'm definitely positive. I think things are moving in the right direction. It is slow, it is incremental, hopefully, fingers crossed, but it is happening.
Yeah, cool. Well, I just once more along the panel, I just to pick up on the spirit of that. Clive, are you positive about that? Obviously, the online safety bill is not and currently going through the Parliament, but in general, in terms of attitudes and the fertile ground for the messaging you're doing, are you feeling positive about that at the moment?
Yeah, I definitely feel a little more impetus around just trying to get everything right than happened in the past.
You've seen a lot more emphasis on trying to get those sorts of things. Impetus, sorry. Yes, I've seen a lot more impetus on trying to get those sorts of things right than there has been in the past.
Cool. Sam, and are you positive with the guidelines, I guess, in the sense of seeing them adopted and become a day-to-day reality for people without having to check almost, I guess?
I am, in the sense that as Joe's generation comes through, you're just going to be left behind if you're not on board and you're not doing this, because people will just speak to themselves on social media.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you have to do it. I'm slightly concerned about policy areas and government and money and all of that, but it's a separate conversation.
Yeah. And Shani, you're describing an intersectionality which you were clearly concerned about when we met and we were talking about it. That went straight to the point of that. Do they have to build up? Are there missing ingredients that are going to get us there, or do you feel like we're going in that direction? It's just that these conversations need to come a bit faster.
I think when we point it out, people are like, oh yeah. And I think whether purposely or accidentally, we have historically excluded people. And when we talk about inclusion, you have to be intentional about it. So personally, I don't think it's just something that we just have to sit back and expect is going to happen. I think it's something we have to be much more intentional about.
And whereas Joe, you sound like it's intentional, but it's just a natural element of everything that you're doing. That's essentially how you stepped into that role. This is just how I'm going to do it.
I guess so. I guess it's just a learning process for everyone. Like no one's perfect, but all we can do is listen and try to improve, I guess. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to hear from all of you. There's a brilliant conversation, and we hadn't thought that thread was going to be about the rules and who follows come from, but that was a great way of pulling it together. So thank you so much for your time and your input. It was really fantastic to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to play a video recording of the conversation with Francesca now, and we are running a little bit late, so I'm going to ask if we could put it straight on. So Adi Latif from AbilityNet spoke to Francesca. We approached her. She's a playwright, she's in the public eye. If you aren't sure who we're talking about, once you see her chatting, you'll realise who we're talking about immediately. And we wanted to talk about, we had an idea that we wanted to talk about fairy tales and the way they influence our perspective on disability, and it's embedded in the way we communicate. But Francesca led that conversation off down another path altogether, really. So this is a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to this session where we're going to be looking at how disabled people have been portrayed in fairy tales. I'm joined today by a very special guest, a very accomplished guest, who is an actor, a comedian, and an accomplished playwright quite recently. In 2000, this is amazing. In 2000, Francesca Martinez became the first female comic to win the prestigious Daily Telegraph Open Mic Awards at the Edinburgh Festival. So that's amazing. I don't know if she was the first disabled person, but the first female person. That's just incredible. Recently, she has written a play, which has been a sellout at the National Theatre, with standing ovations every single night, assuming you can stand. Francesca, thank you so much for joining us on this session. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Eddie. Thank you for that introduction. You have made me feel very old. Well, I probably should start with explaining why I got into comedy in the first place.
Yeah,
So,
sure. That sounds like a good start. Okay, let's do
I
that.
was born wobbly, and from a very young age, I was very aware that adults would look at me with a very strange expression. One that I later learned was pity.
Oh.
And I really didn't understand how so-called mature adults were judging me on the way I walked, the way I talked, rather than who I was, Francesca, because I grew up in a very loving family. And as a result, I was very confident. And of course, I knew I was wobbly, but that was just one aspect of my life. It was neither good nor bad. It was just my normality. And so it came as quite a shock to realize that the world around me judged me on what I couldn't do rather than what I could. So I really hated the kind of pity attitude that I encountered, the sense that, you know, my disability was tragic in some way. So as a very young child, I decided that the best way to kind of this pity bubble was to be funny. So I developed a very strong sense of humor. I became the child that said really cheeky things that made people laugh. And I thought that when I made people laugh, I earned their respect. And I felt that my humor kind of transcended my wobbliness and made people see who I was behind my wobbles. So I really fell in love with the power of comedy. And I started to deploy it all, you know, across all areas of life, at school, with my classmates, with my teachers, even with my doctors, who, in a way, were the worst in terms of treating me with a patronizing attitude. Even though they'd gone to medical school for like 7 years, I realized they weren't capable of just treating me like a human being. So I encountered this fear from a very young age, and it quickly made me realize that I'd been born into a world that had very strong assumptions about disability. So I fell in love with comedy, and I decided that I would become an official comedian. I thought, I'm doing this in my anyway, why not get paid for it?
Why not get paid for it? I love it. So in a way, you're saying you used comedy as a little tool to burst the pity bubble, as you called it. I love that. That's great.
Well, you know what I loved, Addy? I loved the fact that I could kind of wobble on stage and be in front of strangers and very quickly release the tension in the room and deal with prejudices and assumptions, but in a very funny, light-hearted way. So it wasn't worthy, it wasn't boring, it wasn't lecturing, it was entertaining. And I quickly thought, wow, instead of kind of trying to challenge people's views one person at a time, comedy allowed me to do it hundreds or thousands of people at a time. So it became a very powerful part of my life, a space where I could really express myself. And also I could, in a broader sense, humanize a scary label. There is so much fear still around difference, even though it's a natural and normal part of humanity. Disability has always existed and it always will exist. And I really fell in love with the capacity that comedy really presented to me. It really allowed me to, I guess, help people see the person behind the different packaging. And ultimately, I think we're all a bit wobbly. I think some people are physically wobbly like me, and other people are emotionally wobbly. And we're all dealing with our own set of problems and struggles.
How do you think, so the way society is, the way the perceptions are about people who are, how much do you think that comes from folk tales and fairy tales? Do you have anything to say on that? Do you think we've been shaped because of that in a way?
Well,
partly.
Definitely. I mean, I think it might be a slight chicken and egg scenario. So, like, are fairy tales reflecting dominant narratives and attitudes, or do they affect those attitudes? I think both can be true, but I think often they end up confirming very lazy prejudices about disability. And I know as a child, like all children, I love fairy tales, I love stories, I love being transported to other worlds. But I did feel remarkably invisible from those worlds. And when I grew up and thought more about these tales and what they were kind of sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly saying, the messages were quite dubious. So, I mean, fairy tales often bestow physical disabilities on bad people, and these disabilities are often portrayed as a punishment or as something which will bring them great misery and suffering. And these stories usually conclude with a good character shedding their impairment or a bad character being condemned to a life of isolation and suffering. And I think while fairy tales can work on a symbolic level, so using universal archetypes, that can be very powerful in their impact, they do often portray dubious messages about disability and the sense that disability is a punishment and is a tragedy and is a negative, and that people are going to be condemned to a life of isolation, and that people are going to encounter them and just experience great fear and almost repulsion and disgust at the hideous impairment. And there's also a very deep assumption running through these tales that disabled people crave to be normal. And normality is their way out of suffering. Normality is their only path to happiness. So I think many of these messages are not very healthy for either disabled children or able-bodied children, because they present disability in a very black and white way, and they simply convey a lot of prejudices. And I don't think prejudices occur from any malice. But I think prejudice often occurs from ignorance.
Yeah.
So as I said before, one of the areas I've encountered most prejudice in my life is within the medical community, because they look at someone like me and immediately they're looking at me as a faulty product. They're very aware of what's gone wrong in my brain to result in someone like me. And of course, that's a very narrow way of looking at a human being. And I find it a very disempowering way and a very negative way to look at certain people as like faulty products or, you know, failed version of the correct version. And I think this action, which I feel is highly superficial, that suffering, human suffering, comes from inhabiting a body that is not normal. I think that's a very toxic idea and entirely inaccurate, and one that is perpetuated by many fairy tales. Because I want to say the opposite is true for me, and my suffering that I've encountered in my life never came from being wobbly, but it's come from living in a world that sees difference and that breeds self-loathing. So in my mind, that is what we've got to eradicate. We've got to eradicate the toxic attitudes and the unhealthy value systems that make people fearful of difference within ourselves and others. And I really would love to see fairy tales that promote a more nuanced, truthful view of humanity. And I believe that if we really want to eradicate suffering in humanity, don't eradicate difference, eradicate toxic value systems that make people compare themselves to impossible standards of beauty and make them think that they're not good enough as they are. Because I really think the path to self-acceptance and happiness comes from loving your own body, however it works, because all our bodies are miracles and they give us life. We wouldn't be here without them. And also, I think we need to cultivate an appreciation of difference and of celebrating that difference in humanity. Because if you think about it, all our social progress and innovation as a species comes from diversity, diverse ways of thinking, diverse approaches, diverse experiences. I think we need to try and use our universal stories to tell better stories that will actually reflect the world we live in, rather than some kind of lazy, superficial version that just confirms stereotypes and fear.
So if we were on, thank you. If we were to look at some fairy tales, such as say The Little Mermaid, go back to the original version. Was that one you liked? Was that one of your faves on your list?
Yeah, I think as a child, these cartoons are very magical. They transport you into a different world. And I mean, they're full of creativity and craft and skill. I remember loving the idea of a mermaid and a world under the sea. But then again, when you look at the ending, you know, Ariel loses her beautiful voice, or sacrifices her voice for a pair of legs. So the assumption is that the man she loves will never love her unless she's like everybody else and normal and can fit in. So again, when you look at the actual message behind the story, it's quite a dubious one. And again, it confirms this notion that to be happy, to find love, we need to fit in, we need to hide who we are, and we need to change our differences and become more acceptable to others. And
So
when you
what?
think about that's not a great message. But it's funny that one level you can kind of just go, oh, you know, they're just stories, don't take them this seriously. But of course, storytelling within our culture plays such an important role, and stories reflect how we see ourselves and how we relate to each other. So I think we do have to be careful about the messages portrayed, especially to our young children, because they're at an age where all their perceptions and attitudes are being formed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just as a we fun exercise, if we were to create a more inclusive happy ending for Ariel the mermaid, you know, let's go with the version, she can't talk anymore. What would be the happy ending in that situation? Because obviously it's portrayed that she can't talk, so she's less of a person. We need some magic to fix.
Yes.
What do you think we could do in that scenario? We've got an Ariel who can't talk. How can her life be great if she can't talk?
Going back one step even, I love a version where she doesn't have acquire 2 legs and give up her voice. You know, why can't she still stay a mermaid and the prince learns to love her different things with her? So that's going back even to a more
Good answer.
I guess if we're going with the version where she loses her voice, well, there are many other ways of communication, as we know. And deaf people communicate in their own language all the time and with no issues. And many deaf people are proud to be deaf and have a very rich culture. So the ending could reflect that, you know, she could develop sign language and the prince could get off his lazy ass and learn it too.
Yeah, I agree. That sounds like a perfect happy ending there. Francesca, just coming towards the end here. As a playwright, you're an accomplished playwright, and how do you think that the characters you create in your play, how do you reflect those? How do you present those characters with regards to, you know, the archetypes and the stereotypes that people have about disabled?
Well, the secret about disability, as you well know, is that we are, shock horror, just people. I know. Let's begin for a minute. We are just people. And that is the conclusion you come to when you are either disabled or experience disability in your family or friendship circle or life. So I was really excited about writing fully complex human beings who were disabled and who, like everyone, had their own set of strengths, their own set of weaknesses, their own problems, their desires. I was really keen to communicate that disabled people want love and sex and passion as much as anyone else. There's this very weirdly dubious idea that disabled people are asexual and no one of ever find them attractive, and we're kind of infantilized. So it's very important to me to show certain characters with very strong and passionate love lives. And
I never knew disabled people could have sex. Can have
No,
sex? Are they included in that?
is it a big moment for you to realise this?
Yeah, thanks.
I know, but you make a good point there. It sounds so crazy that in 2022 we are still having to challenge these incredibly immature, childish notions that because a person's body works in a different way, they are different from us. And the truth is very simple. Human beings, despite their skin color, sexuality, gender, religion, we all want the same thing. We want to be respected. We want to be loved. We want to do fulfilling work. We want to feel like members of society.
Amazing. And what more can we do, Francesca, to address the issue of, when disabled people are portrayed on TV or in films or in fairy tales, or when people are writing, what advice would you have for them to be able to portray disabled people in the correct light that we deserve?
Well, I think a key part of it is allowing writers with lived experience to write their own depictions.
On that wonderful note there, Francesca, thank you so much. I can be asking you questions for a long time, but I think our time is up. It's been so educational for me. It's been so confirming. You've been able to provide clarity on things that I experience as having a disability myself, but haven't been so articulate or so self-observant enough. So it's been really helpful for me. Hope the people watching and listening found this session helpful. And if you are wanting to know more about fairy tales and how disability has been predicted and put in them, really interesting book by Amanda Leduc called Disfigured, and that is quite comprehensive and it goes into fairy tales and shows all the good, bad, and the ugly. Francesca, thanks so much. Any last words you want to say? End the session.
It's been a real pleasure, and I'm just very honoured that you asked me, and it made me focus on this issue more than I have done and realise the importance of creating different kinds of stories for our children.
Great, thank you very much. Addy, that was fantastic. Thank you, Addy's here. Francesca's not, sadly, but you can see she's really passionate and articulate, exactly as Addy said, about that topic. Her play was at the National Theatre, All of Us, and sold out, standing ovations every night. So she's having a real impact in terms of the way the stories are told, and it was fantastic to hear all the different take that she has on how we present disability. So I hope you've learned something. What an incredible panel, particularly the panel for being here and talking through those different issues and the way that we pull the guidelines together. For Jonathan, who joined us from New York on his wife's birthday to join us live, so that was fantastic to have a chance to catch up with him. And then Francesca to have shared her thoughts about how we portray disability in all sorts of places. Now we're going to have some drinks and some networking and a chance to hear your thoughts about that amongst ourselves. So thank you very much for joining us, and thanks everybody who's online for following the story as well. Thank you.